yes, John and I go back. I was glad that he didn't say he's an old friend of mine. I would rather say long-standing friend than old friend. I'm sure he's got friends that are older than me, but nonetheless, we certainly have participated in many things together. And it's wonderful when you have a relationship that approaches 50 years. I was very young back then. 50 years, and you see faithfulness. Faithfulness is one of those attributes in a relationship that you cannot discern immediately. It takes time. It takes time to know who's really faithful. That's why Paul instructs Timothy to give the ministry to faithful men. And you can only develop that understanding of that individual over time. And so certainly we've watched John and Laura on their many adventures and continually being a source of all that we believe a ministry couple should be. And so it's a real blessing. Today we're going to look at something that I entitled Evidence for the Exodus. Now, come on, machine. Do it to me. A lot of times when you deal with ancient things, people will ask, is this particular history important? Well, there are certain key events recorded in Scripture that provide the fundamentals for faith in the biblical narrative. For the Christian, the record of the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ are foundational truths. Without those foundational truths, we would be nothing different than any other religion that requires their followers to just have faith and make a blind leap into the intellectual abyss. And so that which the Bible gives us is something that has substance that we can test. But for the Jews, their salvation experience happened when they departed Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. Here the nation was born. Here the nation of Israel was given the laws of God, and here the nation of Israel would be given their instruction on what they were to do as a people ruled by God. Now, without verifiable history, how can we even trust the Bible? And let me tell you, having trafficked in this area in the Middle East for many decades, you would be surprised how much of the biblical narrative is difficult to prove archaeologically. And so it is a quest. Not that we need it in that one sense, but in another sense, it does build our confidence. The story of the Exodus is something that we should all be familiar with to one degree or another. But the real question is there any evidence for the Exodus? Now, how many of you have a map in the back of your Bible? And if you look at that map, I normally would start at this point and say, how many of you believe everything in your Bible? And most dutiful Christians would raise their hands and said, I believe everything in my Bible. And then I would say, do you believe the map in the back of your Bible? Because this map is a construction of a lot of conjecture. I have a lot longer presentation that I can do on this, but John told me to give the summarized view, so I'm going to race through some things that I want you to look at. You see, the traditional view is very confusing if you actually begin to investigate it. They leave the area of the encampment of Israel at Goshen, and they begin to go, is it through the Reed Sea? Is it through the Gulf of Suez, also referred to as the Red Sea? And then in my Bible, of course, their next major stop is a place called Mara, and it has a question mark next to it. Now, when I see something like that, I think, then you're not sure, are you? At least they're being honest. But if you go there today to Egypt, there's a sign that says Mara, so you know it must be true now. They have even some stores there where you can buy some bitter water that you can't drink. Then to Elam, that's another one. This is where there's supposed to be 12 wells and 70 palm trees, and you can buy bottles of water there. So, and that water you can drink. And then from there, you go down to the traditional Mount Sinai site. Well, considering the tradition, this is Jebel Musa, that is Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula. At a elevation lower than the summit is the St. Catherine's Monastery. And if you understand that it was Queen Helena, the mother of Constantine, that after the conversion of her son, went around the land of Israel and had visions. And every time she'd have a vision, she'd say, this is where that took place, and they would build some kind of a monastery or some kind of a way of recognizing the visions that she had. And so that was the result of this, and it was built in the 4th century AD. But as real experts look at this, and I will tell you that I'm going to present some stuff that I want you to test. John made reference to the fact that our ministry is called Koinonia House or K House, and our banner verse is Acts 17:11. If you don't know what that is, it simply says, don't believe anything Ron Mattson tells you, but check it out for yourself. All right, Paul was of course referring to the Bereans, but really I want you to put your discerning hat on today as we go through this. And so this happens to be Dr. Zahi Hawass, who's the Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities and Director of the Giza Pyramid Excavation. And he says this about the Sinai Peninsula. Archaeologists who have worked here have never turned up evidence to support the account of the Bible. Now at this point you might say, well, of course he would say that. Why would an Egyptian want to admit that such an event took place? And so I'll lead you to a man named David Wolpe. David Wolpe is the rabbi of the Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. Well, he's got the right name. He's the assistant to the chancellor at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York, and he's considered one of the 50 most influential Jews in America. So he certainly has, as they would say, a dog in the fight. His synagogue is called Sinai Temple, and he's one of the most influential Jews in the United States. And here's a quote from him. 3 years ago on Passover, I explained to my congregation that according to archaeologists, there was no reliable evidence that the Exodus took place, and that it almost certainly did not take place the way the Bible recounts it. Finally, I emphasized it didn't matter. Well, this is an incredible statement from a leader within Judaism, because in doing so, he's admitting something that openly most Jews in Israel, secular or not, also agree with. That the very basis of the history of Israel, leaving Egypt and being led by God to the Promised Land, has no archaeological evidence. The Jews admit that. So when you have the current sense of the world to delegitimize Israel, the Jews themselves feed into that because they have no evidence of their own exodus, which is how they are defined as a nation. Now, this traditional site is the problem. The problems with this conjecture is there's no archaeological evidence there. When you consider that from the book of Exodus, at least 1.2, maybe 2 million people resided at the base of this mountain for 2 years. Now, how many of you have gone to a campsite where somebody else has been before you and not found some residual of them being there? Well, they were there for almost a year, and there's not one shard of pottery that would indicate that anyone lived there for any extended period of time. There's no geographical evidence. In other words, the Bible is very specific as to what the surroundings were. And even the mountain itself doesn't match that which the Bible describes. The Egyptians had turquoise mines in the southwestern Sinai Peninsula since 2000 BC. So they already had an industry there. It's part of Egypt. The northern Sinai had a significant Egyptian military presence at the time of the Exodus. And so there were fortifications throughout because the Sinai area was a military zone to protect mainland Egypt from the invasions that would come from the north, from the Phoenicians and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the Egyptians controlled the Sinai Peninsula until 106 AD when the Romans annexed it. And so it has always been a part of Egypt. So the question that we're going to start with was, then that sounds like an impossible deal. There's nothing there to investigate. So how do we investigate? Well, over the years, we've had a lot of experience of working with the Israel Antiquity Authority, the IAA, and we've had the pleasure of participating and also being witness to a lot of very interesting discoveries. And there is a discipline that they employ, and I'm going to employ that here on some of the information that I'm going to show you. Good investigation of ancient things is simply this. There's three witnesses. One is archaeology itself. That is the what. Now, an archaeologist will call whatever he finds a finding. You'll never hear an archaeologist worth his salt say, I discovered something. He just simply finds something, and then you discover something about it. So archaeology is number one. Next is geography. Where did you find it? And it's very important to establish, so where did you find your finding? And that's the location. And number three, the chronology. And from what era is this? And there's a specific discipline for determining you found this old piece of pottery or whatever it is there a way of dating it? And so that's the timing of what you found. And so all of that together is the discovery. You have to have all three elements there. Now, in dealing with the subject of the evidence for the Exodus, we're going to begin with the Exodus account itself, Exodus chapter 3. Now, Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And so we understand where Moses is at this time. At the age of 40 years old, he fled before Pharaoh. He ran and he came to Midian, and he lives there for 40 years. He marries the daughter of Jethro, the priest of Midian, and so he's in the land of Midian. Then God begins to speak to Moses through the burning bush, and he says, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I sent to you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So we now have from the text some guidelines, a compass as it were. It's going to be in the land of Midian, and this mountain called the Mount Horeb, also referred to as Sinai, is going to be in Midian, and this is where the children of Israel are supposed to come when Moses leads them out of the land. But if you were still not quite sure, you can turn to the New Testament, or Galatians chapter 4 says this, now this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. Now, how on earth, for the past more than 1,000 years, we have people producing maps of the journey of the children of Israel in the Sinai Peninsula when Galatians 4 tells us it's in Arabia? Nobody pays attention of it. Why is that so? It's because tradition has an incredible power to turn your eyesight away from what they're actually seeing. And you just won't see it because of tradition. And this tradition has been around since the 4th century AD. Midian is this northeastern area of Saudi Arabia. Midian was never what we call today the Sinai Peninsula. And this is the target. It's going to be in this area. Now, there's been many places of the crossing of the children of Israel for the crossing of the Red Sea as a big event. There's, of course, the supposition that it wasn't actually the Red Sea, it was actually the Reed Sea, and you get there through a way of reading the Hebrew text. And I like to point out for those people that are favorites of that view, well, that's really a miracle, because that means that Pharaoh's army drowned in a foot of water. There's the North Suez idea, and that would be like, escaping Egypt to go to Egypt. As I've already pointed out to you, they already had military posts there and turquoise mines throughout the area of Mount Sinai that predate even the 430 years of the nation of Israel serving in Egypt. And so in the last sort of 35, 40 years, there's been more realization that we need to start at the end and realize the first body of water you're going to cross coming there from Egypt is the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, all of this is called the Red Sea. There just need to be the Gulf of Aqaba of the Red Sea, or the Gulf of Suez of the Red Sea. Now, of these two options, the first one that most people are familiar with if they've trafficked in this area was proposed by a man named Ron Wyatt. And he went over there in 1984 and came back with some amazing stories of what he said that he found. You come out to this delta area, and obviously if you come through that set of canyons through the wadi onto this, you can see you would be trapped. You can go no further. And so he and his sons apparently began to do some research, and he was the one that published this particular diagram that said there's an underwater land bridge from one side to another. And perhaps some of you, if you've researched this, might have come across this. And it's only 100 feet under the water. And so that would have been the point at which God would have created the dry land, and the nation of Israel would have gone over there. And the number of pastors and Bible studies that use that particular graphic, it's incredible. And so these are all charts from his presentations, that there's an underwater land bridge that takes you across to Saudi Arabia from the Sinai Peninsula. He also reports to have found a 15-foot tall pink granite pillar that he said was placed there by Solomon. There's no inscriptions on it, so that's speculation, of course. He said that he began to find coral that was formed around chariot wheels, even finding himself a golden chariot wheel and encrusted hubs of chariots. And of course, he relates that back to the images they have in Cairo of the chariots, the four-spoke chariots that would have been at the time of the Exodus. And it's very compelling when you see these things. And for decades, people thought, wow, well, the artifacts of the Exodus have been found, especially the drowning of Pharaoh's army. But there's a problem with this conjecture. Number one, there's no land bridge. That was a nice piece of graphic art, but there's no land bridge. We'll go back to his picture. And when I was there in Saudi Arabia, I went to a dive shop that would give me a map of this area so I could look at what the subterranean layout is. This is that dive thing, and as we focus down, the depth of the water is basically 799 meters. Call that 800 meters. That's 2,400 feet underwater. That's hardly 100 feet, is it? So there is no land bridge. Number two, all the artifacts that he reports to have found, there's no independent verification. If you watch the National Geographic's channel or whatever, when they're dealing with archaeology, they always lay some kind of scale next to it so you know, how big is this thing? How big is that? Is it this big or this big? I know how big an Egyptian ancient chariot wheel is. The chariot wheel is about 4 feet in diameter. So were these things 4 feet in diameter? And were they, and just because it's something coral encrusted, they have what's called table coral, which can appear like that. But because there was no metrics used, what was the size of these things? And also, what's the geolocation? When I did my exploration in 2020, I took a Garmin with me, a very high-end Garmin, and every single place we went, every picture that we took a longitude, latitude shot of it so that we knew exactly where we were, so that we could show the evidence that we found. And that's the way archaeology is actually done. So if you have somebody that says, I found this, where did you find it? And not a clue. The third thing is this. How many of you have been on a sandy beach at the ocean? And you walk out on the sandy beach, and if you stand in the lapping water, what happens to your feet? It sinks into the sand, right? That's called liquefaction. It's a natural process because the top sort of 6 to 12 inches of that sand is liquefied, so you're not actually standing on something solid. So anything that would go to a sandy bottom in the ocean that's heavy, it will be sucked into it. And you can demonstrate that for yourself if you don't believe me. And so when he says this is a 3,500-year-old gold chariot wheel, because of the 4 spokes, I would argue with liquefaction it would disappear. For 10 years, my wife and I lived in the South Pacific. We lived in New Zealand. And of course, in World War II, the battle fought in the Pacific was primarily at sea or on islands. And there was a lot of carnage. But if you go to those islands today, most of the carnage that was left on the beach has disappeared. And it wasn't because somebody came along and cleaned it up. It just gets absorbed into the ocean itself. And if it doesn't get absorbed, then it's corroded away. And so what you have is something that doesn't match with real science. And the third idea is this. Nuweiba is what's referred to as an alluvial fan caused by flash flooding. And those deposits come down from the mountain. And yes, in the desert, they do have flash floods. If there's anyone here from Arizona, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You can be in the deserts of Arizona, a huge rainstorm will come, and down comes these huge torrents of mixture of soil and water. And so what we see today cannot be the same as it was 3,500 years ago, approximately when the... now, why am I taking so much time to show you what I don't believe in? Because this is the type of investigation that we're doing. We're not just simply taking, oh, this particular favorite pastor or explorer made these declarations and we're going to believe it. Because after all, that's what the church did for the better part of 1,500 years with Mount Sinai itself. And so we're not, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, sort of thing. And so we're investigating this stuff, and I'm here to just give you a report, and then you're the jury that will make your own decisions. So it was in 1988 that a man named Bob Cornuke, with his partner James Irwin. James Irwin was the astronaut that drove on the moon. He was an Apollo astronaut, and when he came back as a Christian, they weren't going to allow him to do anything that was dangerous after that, at least within NASA, and so he teamed up with Bob, and they began to explore antiquities, and one of them was to look at the traditional site of Sinai Peninsula. And he was the one that came along and said that I think that actually the text takes them down the western shore of the Sinai Peninsula. They turn in the wilderness. They are stopped because of the Migdal, this Scripture says, which is the mountains. You can't go any further. And so they made their way across the Straits of Tiran. Now, if you look at the Straits of Tiran, you can go there today, and there's a coral reef there that stretches across. And coral is interesting in that coral cannot grow on anything deeper than 300 feet of water. So this entire area is less than 300 feet of water, which now the coral's growing up, and at low tide you can literally stand on the coral and be in waist-deep water. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at 16 things. I took the view that this is a better idea for starting the journey. So when I traveled to Saudi Arabia, we started at the tip of the Straits of Tiran, and the Bible tells us a very detailed description of what is going to take place. Chapter 15 says they took a 3-day journey into the wilderness. And so as you cross over, you come into a very large desert place. It's indicated here as sort of this grayish, pinkish area. And you drive for miles and miles, and it's nothing but desert. But then to the north are granite mountains, the highest mountains in Saudi Arabia. And that granite runs underneath this sand. And so the water that collects on the mountains goes down the granite into the aquifer, but because it's just sand, the salt water intermingles with the fresh aquifer, and all the water in that area is brackish. And so here's an example of many, many, many of these brackish ponds that are there. And so you can see you could wander for 3 days and not be able to find water. And so it satisfies to some degree the idea that they could have wandered in this area for 3 days and had trouble. But then it says they then went to the wells of Elim, where there were 12 wells and 70 palm trees. Well, if you keep to the west coast of Saudi Arabia, the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, you come to a place which I think is a good candidate for this 12 wells and 70 palms. There's a small village called Al-Makhna, and if you notice, there's a huge green patch there. And when you travel there, it's absolutely covered with palm trees. I didn't take the time to count to see if there were 70. I thought 3,500 years might make a little bit of a difference. But clearly, it is an oasis. And when you go there, you will see these pools, and you will witness the bubbling of clear, pure, drinkable water. And there are multiple around there. And so, number 2, I can see, where that's fitting the biblical narrative. That's a day's walk in a straight line, and they probably would have stuck along the area of the Red Sea at this point. Plus, remember, this is familiar territory for Moses. He came from this area of Midian. Then it says they went through the wilderness of Sin. Now, they didn't go to Reno, okay? Sin in Hebrew is the word thorns. It's the base word eventually for Sinai. It's a thorny area, and it is very tough. And in an expanded version of this teaching, I would give you more about that journey through this, but they end up in a place called Rephidim. The word Rephidim in Hebrew means resting place. Now, if you were on a holiday and you have your motorhome, or the kids are in the back saying, "Are we there yet?" You would see a sign that said resting place. What would you expect to see? A resting place, right? Well, this happens to be about 50 miles away from anything in the heart of the Saudi desert, and it's pretty bitter. And so we'll come on to that. But on their journey there, they pass near the home of Jethro. Jethro is the father-in-law of Moses. And so to the south of there, there's a city called Al-Bada. And if you go there, they actually refer to it as Midian. And they have something they call the Caves of Jethro. and the well of Moses. Now, these are Muslims. This is, Queen Helena didn't come here and establish this. This is them venerating what they believe is a prophet of Allah. And so they believe this is the home of Jethro, and they have a number of features that are there, and we won't go into that now. But eventually, as they come through the wilderness of sin, thorns, they come and they camp at Rephidim. Now, as you come into this large valley area, to the top of the picture, it begins to look gray and stippled. That actually is a very steep mountainside, and then there's a valley below it. And so what I'm going to show you are structures that are in the lee side of the mountain. In other words, the sand doesn't blow over this area. And so these structures are man-made, and I'll show you what they look like. They're large, probably 20, 30 square in diameter circles, and they're all over the place. There's dozens and dozens of these, and they're against the mountain. Now, the speculation of the Saudi Arabian archaeologists is these are the outlines of tents. You see, they didn't have tent pegs back then. They didn't have a sporting goods store to go get their Coleman tent, and so they would take with one pole and they would draw it out and hold it down. And so these aren't animal pens. These are most likely something that was used to hold down a tent. And this is only a fraction of what they believe is in the area, the rest of it being covered by the sands of 3,500 years of sand in the desert. From there, they're of course encamped in a place where they cry out to Moses and say, there's no water here. And trust me, there is no water there. If you go into the desert without lots of water by the caseload, you may never come back. It's incredibly dry. Well, we're familiar with the split rock. Well, a couple back in the 1990s named Jim and Penny Caldwell, they were working in Saudi Arabia. They were looking around this area, and they came across this very unusual feature. And so they began to explore it. And as you see, this large rock is sitting on top of a small mountain, which is a challenge to climb. But you'll notice something else, that the rocks around it are smooth. Now, the rest of the rocks you're going to see that I'm going to show you are all jagged. Here, they're all smooth. And so here's an example. Our drone, we've climbed up, we're inside of the cleft of the rock. So that gives you a sense of the size of it and its location. To the right in this picture, you'll see the light sandy color all of a sudden becomes more dark gray and goes up to what almost looks like Shasta Dam. It's an unusual feature in that this seam sort of appears out of nowhere, and on the other side of it is a dry lake bed, probably 50 to 60 acre dry lake bed. It's massive. This is an area, there's no streams, no rivers, why would there be a lake bed? And so as you approach it, you begin to notice that there are petroglyphs. These are ancient drawings on stones, and they're all around the area. So this is an area where there's never been a village, there's never been a city, there's never been anything, but around this dry lake bed are these petroglyphs. And many of them looks like a sandal. And so what could that be? Well, again, our conjecture is simply this. The nation of Israel was told that when they get to the promised land, wherever they place their foot, that land will be theirs. And so the speculation is that perhaps this was them in their excitement saying, honey, we better get in first. You don't need 4, we're going to probably need 8 of these landmarks, that mark the way in which we're going to define our property. And by the way, later on, the Levitical law will tell people they are not to remove or move the ancient landmarks. And this is what they're referring to in that sense. Everybody had an inheritance, and it was marked out by stone markers. So as you go around, you see the result of humans being there. These are images carved in the patina of the rock, and they're all around. So human activity there for a little while. It's their version of graffiti to say, I was here. You know, they didn't have train cars to tag, so they tagged this kind of stuff. Now from there, while they're there, the Amalekites attack the children of Israel, and Moses goes up on the mountain, stands probably near that area, and as long as his hands were up, Joshua and the army of Israel are successful. Every time his arms go down, they're defeated, back and forth, and eventually the Amalekites are defeated. And so they build their first altar in this new land. And so at the base of the mountain, we found a number of structures, but this particular one is unhewn stones, and it happens to be 10 cubits by 10 cubits. Now you know what a cubit is, right? 10 cubits by 10 cubits. A cubit is the distance between your elbow and your finger, depending on if you're tall, a little longer. But my point is, and this turns out to be about 10 cubits by 10 cubits. And it'll later be codified in the building of the tabernacle with a bronze altar. But it's clearly an altar. It's not a structure. It's solid inside with unhewn stones. And so as we look at this area, we see there's the split rock, there's the altar, there's the footprints, and you can see the dark line of what seems to appear as a seam that comes out, and then there's the dry lake bed. So from there, we're going to go to the camp at the base of Mount Sinai. That's where chapter 19 takes us. In the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. For they had departed from Rephidim and had come to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. And so they're going to make an encampment there. So as was traditionally reported to have taken place in the Sinai Peninsula, this is now the biblical record of saying they go to Sinai, and we've established Sinai is in Midian. And so from that place, to the east of it is a ridge system called Jabal Lawz. Jabal Lawz. It's sort of humorous to me that many early people were talking about this, and they say, isn't that amazing? The place where Moses gets the law is in a mountain called Jabal Lawz. No, that's Arabic for almonds. It's the only place in Saudi Arabia where almonds are natural. And that becomes important because Aaron's rod is what? An almond. And it's the only place in that region, especially Sinai Peninsula, where almonds grow, is on Jabal Lawz. So you have to go around the tallest mountain in Saudi Arabia, and you come to an area which I think is a good candidate for the camp. Now, as you get there, it's 1.5 kilometers, so call it 1 mile in diameter. And when you consider the fact that these people had God giving them DoorDash manna to their door, they didn't have to go out, they didn't have to spread out. They could just live in their tents, go outside their tents and collect what God gave them 6 days a week. And God also provided them a fresh supply of water. And so I'll show you the wadi that is referred to there. And so it's an area where you could put 1 million, 2 million, maybe even 3 million people there in tents. Now, as I look to the west of that, there is a large fenced-off area. Now, you are still in a part of Saudi Arabia that from Tabuk, where we stayed east of here, there was 2 hours of driving, a half an hour on paved roads and an hour and a half off road, rough terrain. And then you come across a 10-foot high fence that's been there from probably the 1940s. It's very substantial. Now, there was a man that we've come in contact with. His name is Dr. Kim. He was the personal physician to the governor of Mecca. And after 30 years of service there, he asked the government, can I take artifacts from this area back to Korea? And they said yes. And so he has more than 200 artifacts from this area. And that's why they chain link fenced it off, because people were taking the artifacts. Here's some of the gold that was found there. It's in the Riyadh Museum. These are figurines. Now, these are Semitic. The Egyptians thought beards and hair was dirty, so these are not Egyptian. These are Semitic, which leads you to believe. But more interestingly, on bottom is a menorah. Here's a woman, the back, a menorah, a very angry face with a menorah on the bottom of it. I mean, these are incredible finds in this area. Now, I'm working with Dr. Kim, and we're trying to encourage him to get things independently analyzed and processed, because the carved stoned images, I've shown them to my friends in Israel, and they say it's probably from the late Bronze era. That would be a little after the Exodus, or more likely the Second Temple period, which is 516 BC to 70 AD, probably that. And what these probably are relics of Jewish pilgrims coming and leaving a marker. It's the opposite of going someplace and taking away something to remind yourself. Instead, in Jewish tradition, even today, when you go somewhere, you leave a stone as a memorial of your visit there. And if you've ever been to a Jewish cemetery, you'll see all these little rocks on the top of their cemetery sites, because that's what the Jews do. They go and they leave something as a reminder that they were there. So when they get there, they are told to put boundary markers around the base of the mountain, lest the people break through, touch the mountain, and die. And so we're going to take a look in more detail at this area right here. This is the end of the gorge, and before us in the middle of the picture is the wadi. The black lines represent the mountains that go up from there, and they are quite steep. And so we're going to be looking at this area here. And we noticed that there were some very large stones that seemed to be creating a line of demarcation. This is what the ground looks like when water doesn't flow over it. It looks like shrapnel everywhere. It's really difficult to walk there. And so people say, what was it like, walking around? I said, your head's down the whole time. You're trying to figure out where to put your feet and not sprain your ankles. But as you go around, you begin to notice these very, very, very large rocks that seem to be an equidistant, not necessarily from each other, but from the base of the mountain. Your initial response is, well, they must have rolled down from the mountain itself. But when you begin to see the size of them, and many of them are on the awkward upward position, that's not where something would naturally roll down and stop at its most precarious. And so all around, and these stones are large, and again, you're wondering, yeah, you just used a macro lens on your camera, didn't you? Well, to give you a sense of how large these things are, that's how large the rocks are. They're huge. They're absolutely massive. And I've had people ask me, well, how do the Jews move such large stones? And I tell them, look, ancient man was a lot smarter than we were. And they were capable of doing stuff that, because we don't understand it, we simply say aliens did it. Aliens must have helped them. Well, so there are a number of those things, and they're a distance, and they do create what seems to be a visible barrier that don't go beyond this. The next thing, of course, is in chapter 19, verse 18, we hear that God descended upon the mountain in smoke and fire. And so we would wonder, is there a blackened mountain? Now, Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in a fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And so, would there be a residual of that? Well, in 1988, Bob Cornuke and his partner on this journey, a guy named Larry Williams, went to Saudi Arabia twice. It was illegal to go there, and so they snuck in, and they tell a very interesting story of their adventures in doing so. And he was the only one for more than 20 years that had any photographs of what people were reporting. And so anybody that talked on this would use Bob's 2 photographs. And the strange shadowing or blackening of the top of this mountain. And people say, well, it was a passing cloud or trick photography or whatever. And so it was a pleasure when Bob and I went back in 2020 to go back, and there you can see the sky is clear, and there we're looking to the blackened top of this mountain. And so he says, wow, I'm really pleased that it's still there, that it wasn't some kind of accident. You can't go someplace out without a selfie. And so there was the team of the 4 of us, my son Benjamin, who is now with the Lord, Bob Cornuke, myself, and a man named Jim Schmidt. Now, this is the Garmin track of us going up the mountain. We listened to a Bedouin who told us, I will tell you the best way to go to the top. And then when we were about a third the way up, we said, have you ever actually climbed it? And he said, oh, no, not really. I just heard this is a good way to get up there. So we went probably the most difficult route we could find. And that's why there's one route going up. That's the route on the left. And then one route going back. Because we ended up leaving late in the day because the Bedouin required us to have tea with him for 2 hours. So we didn't start our ascent till 11 o'clock in the morning. And we knew it was going to be dark by 6 p.m. But we were still confident. It took us 5 hours to summit. Why? Because the peak is at 7,631 feet, and we started at 5,000 feet. So we had 2,600 feet of rough climbing to do up the mountain. But when you finally get to the top, this is what it looks like. The mountain is covered with this blackened rock. We're looking back toward the Sinai Peninsula, and there you can see the Gulf of Aqaba. And here, as you look at the rock, it has this peculiar patina on the outside, and the top of it is darkened. And the early explorers to this area were saying the rocks were burnt. But being the person that says, but I want independent verification, I want to find out exactly what caused this phenomena. It's really called desert varnish, and it can be common in many desert regions. Its origin, well, some think it's a high concentration of manganese and iron. Others say it's mainly of silica, which breaks down like a gel form and hardens. But all of them say it comes from intense heat. And so nobody knows for sure. You can't find any geologist. I challenged one geologist friend of mine. I said, well, there's your PhD right there. Go define desert varnish, because it is really a mystery. We sent off some rock samples for a blind test of this, and found that the rocks that we sent to them said this rock's been uncharacteristically exposed to intense heat, like the heat of a blast furnace. So we just left it with that. And my intention, of course, is to, Lord willing, maybe go back, collect some more samples, and get some more definitive answer as to why this would happen, especially on top of this mountain. But chapter 20 tells us that Moses built an altar at the base of the mountain. Now you can, if you've got Google Earth, you can see this for yourself. This isn't some kind of stylized photograph. You can go to this area and check this out for yourself. This is what it looks like at the ground level. It's this strange V-shaped structure. Now that's not actually the altar. It's actually a pen for small animals. This is the document by the Saudi Arabian Department of Archaeology. They diagram it as either a quarry, a residence, or an altar. Now, why do they say altar? Because there's ancient ash there. Well, pause for a minute there is no culture or religion in Saudi Arabia that ever sacrificed animals. The Egyptians don't sacrifice animals. It's only the Jews that sacrifice animals. And so, again, one of my tasks that I have on my wish list is to go back, take a core sample, because I now have a company in Israel that will carbon date this for me. And we can verify how old is that ancient ash. Moving on. We're told in chapter 24 that Moses, around that altar, built 12 pillars. Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, 12 pillars according to the tribes of Israel. And so notice the precision here. It wasn't just willy-nilly here or there. It was at the base of the mountain, the foot of the mountain, and then made 12 pillars. Now, when you go there, in that area, there are these peculiar marble carved pillars. Now remember, this isn't the result of somebody's house or a builder left some extra stuff. These are very odd. And when you first go there, your temptation is to say, wow, these would have been stacked on each other in rows of 12s, and these look like 12 pillars. They're all around the place. But the important thing to recognize is that a Jewish pillar is uncarved. That's how you know it's a Jewish pillar. It's stand upright and it's uncarved. So most scholars who look at this will say, no, that's probably a residual of pilgrims coming and building a small synagogue there. That makes more sense. Remember, there's no city or village around this place. Now, of course, there's the golden calf altar. You're familiar with the story of when you leave the kids at home by themselves, watch out, right? You know, some of you laugh because obviously you were never the child, but you were the parent. You know what I'm talking about. You go away for the weekend, you say, kids, look, I can trust you. You know where the refrigerator is. Just don't mess up the house. Yes, we'll be good. And as soon as you leave, you know, the notices go out, party at my house. And then they try to do a good job of cleaning everything up, but they forget that the garbage doesn't come until Tuesday. And so you go out, and there it is. There's in the garbage can is the result of the party they had in your house. And so when Moses and Joshua are up on Mount Sinai, there's something going on that causes a lot of trouble. So all the people broke off the gold earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron, and he received the gold from their hands, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. And then he said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." And so they made this molded calf. Of course, he later would say, "I threw the gold into the fire, and the gold came out by itself." You know, it just sounds like what children do. Yes, I didn't eat that candy bar. Somebody else put that wrapper in my pocket. You know, that's the kind of stuff, right? And so as you look at the area, just by virtue of giving you a sense of perspective, the Moses altar is here. That's that wadi that in flash flood times water flows down that. But across the valley, there is something that, again, you take notice of, because as you look at it, there's an archaeological fence around it. And from the air, it just looks like a pile of rocks. But in 1988, Bob Cornuke took this photograph, and this is clearly a man-made structure. It's huge. It's a man-made structure, and it has a perfectly flat top. So it was a pleasure when we went back. There's the fence. We went back, and Bob Cornuke says, it's still there. You know, it wasn't imagination. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. Well, around the base of it, carved are bovine characters. These are petroglyphs, bovine characters, and they're all around the base of this. Now, this feature appears nowhere else in Saudi Arabia, because there was not a cult in Saudi Arabia that worshiped the Apis bull. That is Egyptian. And in fact, I'll point something out here. This Egyptian cult of the Apis bull, it's represented by these peculiar upward turned horns. And so as you go through this, you'll notice that. And if you know anything about Egyptian gods, of course, and the supreme god is that of Ra, which is the sun. And normally the sun rests within the horns of the Apis bull by imagery. So as you look around, you see these images with the horns representing the Egyptian Apis bull cult. Now that cult in and of itself never reached the area of Midian, so this is not Egyptian, and yet it's there. All around the base of the mountain, there are many of them. This is all around this structure. I won't even call it an altar, I'll just call it a structure. This is what it looks like from the back, the little hill behind it. There you can see one of the quadrants of the top of it, and it's broken off because there are 4 of these things. You can see that it's been cut, 4 of these sitting on top of the mountain. And when you closely look at them, there are rock shims in there, so that they are literally leveled with rock shims, and this one back over time, because of earthquakes or whatever, gave way. So there is a gold altar. Well, obviously, there was a party that was going on. And in fact, we read, so when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation saying, tomorrow is a feast of the Lord. And they arose on the next day, offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, at this point, I want to point out that the Hebrew word play here, don't think they went and played board games or Twister. You know, that wasn't what they were doing. It's a Hebrew word which means to be in intimate contact with one another. The first time it's used is actually with Abraham. Those of you who are familiar with Abraham, when there's a famine in the land and he goes down to Egypt, he's taking his wife Sarah, and he says to her, now, you're so beautiful, sweetheart, that they're going to kill me and take you as wife. So would you please tell them you're my sister? Now that was a half-truth because she was, in fact, his half-sister. And so they go down there, and Pharaoh takes her and puts her in his harem. Of course, what takes place is, we are told in Genesis that the Pharaoh looked out and saw Abraham playing with Sarah and said, why have you done this thing? This is your wife. So I don't think it was because they were playing gin rummy. All right? It's a term in Hebrew that means intimate connection, intimate play in that sense. All right? So, between the golden calf altar and the Moses altar is what I have called the orgy stone. Now, I think we're above 18 in here, so I can proceed. If not, cover your eyes. All right. Now, there's this rock that is standing there. It has that varnish on it. It's obviously not part of this area, so it was brought there. So a closer look at it from Scripture, it says, now Moses saw the people were unrestrained, for Aaron had not restrained them to their shame among the enemies. And that word there is literally naked. These people were naked. Unrestrained is a kind way of saying it. Strong's would say that they were let go or let loose or let alone. They were naked. And so when you look at this, your eyes, of course, immediately go to the 10 bovine images here, again, of the Apis bull cult. But then you'll look around and you'll see the camel. The camel, by the way, if you're discerning enough, I don't know if you can see it from there, but it's a different color, patina, which means it's not of the original carving. Everything else is of the original carving. And of course, you'll see human beings. But let's take a little look at those human beings. You'll notice that there's something very peculiar about them. Now, I'll leave that to your own imagination. but that is the way in which you represent an orgy. In ancient culture, this is an orgy, and this is what Moses is disgusted about. My friend Eli Shukran, who has been the chief archaeologist for the city of David for 25 years, he also has a French passport, and so I encouraged him to go visit the mountain himself, so he went. But of course, he brings some other expertise to play in that he looked at this and noticed that there's something here that all of us missed when we saw this and began to document it. There is the ancient Hebrew letter Aleph. It's an Aleph. It's referred to as Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite, but it's the predecessor of Paleo-Hebrew or modern Hebrew today. The Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Bet is the second letter, and therefore that's why the 22-letter alphabet really has its Hebrew origin. And there's another long thing I could go into, but I'm looking at the clock and realizing I need to move on. Its earliest inscriptions are 1600 BC, found in the Sinai Peninsula. Peculiar place to have a world-changing event take place in the writing of human experience, because prior to that was either cuneiform or hieroglyphs, which are incredibly complicated. And all of a sudden you have the invention of this 22-letter alphabet that takes place in the Sinai Peninsula. And who was working in Egypt at that time? The Israelites. So God is introducing a way in which all phonetic languages would get their alphabet. And of course, the Exodus itself takes place somewhere between 1500 to 1400 BC. Now, next to that, there's another stone I call the worship stone. It's in close proximity to Moses' altar. And when you take a closer look at this and you say, okay, that's kind of a stick figure of maybe some people praising the Lord or dancing around on hot coals, I'm not exactly sure, but it looks interesting to me. And then there's sacrificed things below it, and then maybe even a human being that's below it with the arms down. So I took away and said this is just a symbol of what worship would look like. Well, in the first instance, the ox head is Proto-Sinaitic for Aleph, and if you go down that, you find that in Proto-Sinaitic, the arms raised individual is actually the Hebrew letter Ha, the H. You remember Abram become Abraham with the insertion of the Ha, which is a symbol of breath and also worship, praise. And so you realize what you're looking at here is a sign that says praise, praise, praise. And below it is the altar of Moses. Now, of course, as a result of that wild party, there's going to be a debt to pay. Now, when Moses saw that the people were unrestrained, for Aaron had not restrained them to their shame, then Moses stood in the entrance of the camp and said, "Whoever is on the Lord's side, come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered together to him. And he said to them, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let every man put his sword on his side and go in and out from entrance to entrance throughout the camp, and let every man kill his brother, every man his companion, every man his neighbor." So the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses. About 3,000 men of the people fell that day. Now, he wasn't calling for anarchy. Because there was over 600,000 men that, when they're numbered, make up the army of Israel. This is selective. They're going after a selective subgroup within Israel, and apparently there were 3,000 men that they hunted for and executed them. Now, in Jewish tradition, you need to bury that body in 24 hours. And it needs to be, by the law, buried outside of the camp. So if you travel approximately 4 miles north of here, You'll come to a 28-acre site, which again has a very tall, 10-foot high fence. It's a huge area. And when you go there, you're going to find tombstones. Hundreds and hundreds of Jewish tombstones all around the area. And at the highest spot, you'll see a small altar that's left there, looking back down on the valley below. And so you know you're in a graveyard. Now, this place is almost 100 miles away from any ancient city. And yet it's a huge graveyard. And all around the graveyard are mortars. Now, you remember the children of Israel were given manna, and in the book of Numbers, we're told that they took that manna and ground it. And so these are mortars. But more interesting to me, I found one gravestone that can't be a gravestone because, first of all, it's carved, and it has a massive area for grinding in, the one to the left. And I wondered to myself, what did Moses do with the golden calf? He ground it up and put it in water and made the nation of Israel drink this putrefied water with gold from their idol. Is this it? No, I can't prove that. But it's peculiar in that everything else is according to the Jewish pattern of being an uncarved rock. There are tombs that are of later date around it also. And so we have the gravesite. And the final one that we'll leave you with is the cave of Elijah. 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah kills the prophets of Baal, and then you have Ahab's wife, Jezebel, threatens him, and he runs off. So he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. So we know where he is. And there he went into a cave and spent that night in the place. Behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And so we know that there has to be a cave on the top of the mountain because Elijah went there, and he went to the Mount Horeb in Sinai, same one that Moses went to. And so next to the blackened mountain is a second peak. And as you begin to zoom in, you begin to notice this very unique structure. It is a cave 15 foot tall, 15 foot deep in the top of the mountain. Now, I have asked many geologists to tell me, do you know of anywhere else in the world where this takes place? And their answer is simply this. Caves come about by three processes. One is water erosion. There'll be some kind of a source of water that wears away the rock. Number two, earthquakes. Earthquakes can shift rock around and there can be a cave. And the third is a lava tube. There's a volcano, it comes out these tubes, and then eventually it evaporates and leaves a cave. This has none of those. This is a granite mountain. It has none of these features. And so from that point of view, you look back on this valley that we've talked about, and you can clearly see most of the stones that go around preventing people from coming to the mountain. You can see the altar of Moses. You can see the golden calf altar. You can see the orgy stone, and you can also see at this point the worship stone. And so all the pieces are here. And I had one person at one of my presentations says, "Can I go there?" And I said, "Yeah, I just given you the map. You apply for a tourist visa, you fly to Tabuk, you stay in the Holiday Inn because you want a Western toilet, and they'll give you Western food, and then rent a car from Hertz, and just make sure you've got a tire repair kit and lots of water, and you drive there yourself. There's no mystery to it. The Saudis don't care. But the evidence is there. And so when we look at the biblical narrative, yes, I think we have something that could be example of the 3 days journey, or the wells of Elam, or wandering through the wilderness. Or it is near the home of Jethro. There is a camp at Rephidim. There is something that could have been the split rock of Horeb. There is an altar at its base. There is a camp that was significant in Mount Sinai, left loads of artifacts. There are boundary markers. There is a blackened mountain. There is an altar of Moses. There are 12 pillars, but maybe not what you think. Maybe there's more exploration that needs to take place there. There is an altar that seems to be associated with the golden calf altar. There is signs of a wild party. They didn't put everything away. There is a mass grave, and there is the cave of Elijah. And so, given that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I ask you this question: is there any evidence for the Exodus? You decide. Thank you very much.